This is Mrs. Carnes, and this is part 2 of solving multi-step equations. Again, we need to remember that when we solve an equation, the variable must be alone on one side of the equal sign, and that if you found a solution, it just means that the value that you found for that variable must make the equation true. Let's go ahead and get started on a few more things to remember when solving multi-step equations. The first thing is, if there are if there are like terms in your equation, you must first combine them. So like terms means that you have a 5n and an n. Those are like terms because they both have the n. We also see like terms here in our constants, -8 and a +10. So in order to begin, we can't do any of the other operations. We can't undo addition or subtraction, or we don't want to undo addition or subtraction until we combine these like terms. It will help to simplify our equation. So the 5n is going to get added with the n. Now remember, there's a 1 in front of that n. So what is 5n plus 1m? That gives us 6n. Then we also know that these two guys are like terms and they can be combined. So we have a -8 plus 10. A -8 plus 10 gives us a +2. And we know that that still must be equal to the answer of 32. So now we have an equation that should look very familiar to you. And now you would start with undoing your addition and subtraction. So I see the addition of a 2, so I will undo that by subtracting 2 from both sides. We end up with 6n is equal to 30 because our 2's canceled. Now we see multiplication, so we will use division to undo our multiplication, and we will divide by 6 on both sides, and we end up with a solution that says n is equal to 5 because 6 goes into 30 5 times. So n equals 5 is the solution to that equation. Now again, if you wanted to check that equation, you would take this variable, value of the variable, and you would plug it in for each of these n's. So 5 times 5 would give us 25 here. 1 times 5 would be 5. So 25 and 5 would give us 30. 30 minus 8 and plus 10 would end up giving us 32. So that does work, and so we know that n equals 5 is a solution. So again, if you see like terms, then you must combine those before you begin doing your other steps. Let's take a look at something else. You also know that if there are parentheses that are used to indicate multiplication, you must use the distributive property. So in this example, we see these parentheses here, and we know that the 5 in front of those parentheses is being used to indicate multiplication. So we're going to have to distribute that 5 through the parentheses using the distributive property. And so what we end up with is this first m doesn't change. It just stays m. The plus sign comes down because we know that 5 times m is a positive 5m. And then we also know that 5 times -1 is a -5. And it's still equal to 7. Now we have an equation that we can go ahead and begin to simplify. Before I can do anything, though, I see like terms. I see I have a 1m and a 5m. Those are like terms that I must combine together first. And so we know that 1m plus 5m is 6m. 6m minus 5 is equal to 7 is the equation that we have remaining. I now can use my operations to undo that -5. I can undo that -5 by adding 5 to both sides. And I get 6m is equal to 12. We now know that 6 is being multiplied to the m. So if we undo that operation, we know that we would divide by 6, and we would end up with a solution that says m is equal to 2. m equals 2 is the solution. If I wanted to check, I would plug it back in for the m here and the m here. I would end up with a 2 plus 5 times 2 minus 1 and check to see if it would be equal to 7. What we end up with is 2 minus 1 becomes 1, 5 times 1 is 5, and 5 plus 2 is 7. Since they match, we know that the solution is m equals 2. Something else you want to remember is if you have fractions, you want to try and get rid of them by getting common denominators. So we notice that we have a 3 as a denominator on the first fraction. We have a 2 as a denominator on the second fraction. And we can just go ahead and put a 1 underneath our 7 so that we have fractions on everything. To get common denominators, I would want to have the common denominator between 3, 2, and 1 would be 6. So I would multiply my first fraction by 2, and I would end up with 4/6 x, plus I would multiply my second fraction by 3, and I would end up with 3/2 x, and I would multiply my last fraction by 6, whoops, not 3/2, but 3/6 x, and I would multiply my last fraction by 6, and I would get 42/6. Now, since each fraction has a 6 on it, it would just be like multiplying to get rid of that 6 since it's being divided. It would like be multiplying everything in your equation by 6. And that means that all of those 6's would disappear. You would end up with an equation that doesn't have fractions anymore, which is much easier to deal with. 4x plus 3x is equal to 42. We now see that we have like terms. 4x and 3x is going to give me 7x is equal to 42, and I divide to undo the multiplication, and when I divide by 42, I get x is equal to 6. Now the last thing we're going to look at is if you have decimals in your equation. So you have to get rid of them by moving your decimal point or by multiplying by a power of 100. And so in this case, what I notice is that I have 2 decimal places on this one. I'd have to move it. 2 decimal places I'd have to move here to get rid of the decimal point, and 1 decimal point here. Since the most I have to move is 2, I have to move all decimal points 2 places. Basically, it's like multiplying the entire equation by 100. And then if you do that, what you'll end up with is 50a plus 875 is equal to 1325. Very quickly, we will go through this. Since these steps are steps you already are familiar with, we will subtract the 875 from both sides. We end up with 450 is equal to 50a, and because of multiplication, we will divide by 50. We end up with a is equal to 9, and that is the answer. Again, if you wanted to check, you would just take that 9 and you would plug that 9 in for that a and work this equation out. Now notice, you don't have to get rid of your decimal point. I very easily could have just subtracted 8.75 from 13.25 and divided by 0.5. However, you have to be careful with lining up your decimals and also working with division of decimals. So if you'd rather not deal with that, then the easiest thing to do is multiply by a power of 100 to get rid of it. That takes care of this lesson. We'll go ahead and have one more lesson of things to remember on solving multi-step equations.